after 6 o'clock. We have a really great event here. We're really excited. Thank you for joining us for Austin Design Week. Please make sure that you check out, we still have some amazing events going on this week, so please check it out. Join our Slack workspace as well. And we really want to thank our partners. We have a lot of amazing companies that have supported Austin Design Week and making this possible and making it a free event for people to attend. So we're very, very thankful to our partners. And that's all I have. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Siobhan to get you guys, to Carmen to get you guys started.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We are delighted to have you tonight, and I am very honored to moderate this exciting panel that is being hosted specifically by Latinos in Architecture, the Austin chapter of the AIA, and specifically for Design Week, for us to have a conversation about historic communities of color in Austin, Texas, learning from our past and understanding the impacts of history as we've lived it in Austin, Texas. I have an incredibly esteemed panel, and I know these three women who you will be hearing from today. So I am really excited about the conversation because they bring an incredibly rich history and experience and perspectives to this evening. So just as an intro for this panel, the goal of this roundtable really is to provide designers who are hungry to learn more about this history an understanding of the racial divide the city of Austin has historically faced, and how we can embrace the future more consciously through a social, economic, and political lens. And that includes understanding the impact of the 1928 master plan, which racially segregated Austin, as well as a number of other zoning and land use decisions since then that have continued to negatively impact communities of color in particular. And when we say communities of color in Austin, historically, we are talking about the African-American communities and Mexican-American communities, although our communities of color are diverse. Those are the two prominent groups that have a long-standing history and have most been impacted by a lot of these zoning and design decisions that have been made without their consent. And so on our panel, we have Susana Almanza, who is the Executive Director of Poder, People Organized in Defense of Earth and Her Resources. We have Nefertiti Jackman, who works with our City of Austin Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Department, which has now merged with our Planning and Zoning. So you are now, I believe, planning and housing in transition. But the important thing for you to know is that Nefertiti is there at the front lines of that department, working a lot with the actual programs that we have for anti-displacement and supportive housing. And we have Siobhan Otero, who is with Community Power Workshop, among many other community efforts. And I encourage you all to read the biographies of these incredible people in this panel, because we're not going to take the time to do an elaborate introduction, but it's worth finding out more about them and the incredible organizations that they work with. But I am going to ask us to start with an intro question, a very brief one. So as I mentioned, I do know all of you, and I know that you get requests all the time to speak on panels and in events, to do interviews, to participate in a variety of workshops and conventions and all kinds of things. And so I would like to know from you in your own words, very briefly in like 30 seconds, why did you show up to this panel? Why is it important to have this conversation about what communities of color have faced in the past and how we can move toward a more equitable future at Austin Design Week? So I'll start with you, Nefertiti.
We were going to start with our elder, but sure,
okay,
I will go.
Okay, well then, in good practice, we'll start with Susana. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going by the Zoom squares.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think it's important for individuals to hear from this perspective of grassroots people of color.
Thank you, Susana. All right, Nefertiti, you next.
Okay. I think this one was really important to me, primarily because there's been a continuous fight for the existence of Black and Brown communities in space, and having space to continue our cultural traditions and practices is very important. And so this is an intersection. This conversation is an intersection of a lot of the work that I have been doing. So it was really important to me.
Thank you. And Siobhan.
I am honored and excited to join this conversation because I think, Black and Brown communities historically have not been part of the design process, which has led to the erasure of these communities. So it's really important that we have these conversations, bring in those diverse perspectives, and create a new framework moving forward.
Thank you all. So we're going to kick it off. And before we do, I just want to remind folks that if you have access to the chat, please feel free to contribute comments or questions. I probably won't be able to get to all the questions because we've got very little time here, but we do want to open up that conversation, that dialogue. So please do feel free to participate. And you've also got instructions there on how to access the Slack channel rather. I'm still getting used to Slack, sorry. So to kick it off, I'm gonna ask a very loaded question. But I want to ask, I'll start off with Susana Almanza because I know that she has grown up in this history in Austin. And so I'd like to ask, how has the history of Austin's racialized zoning affected communities of color?
Well, Austin's zoning and land use is rooted in racism. And it's fostered the wealth and the safety and the security of Austin's affluent and middle-class communities while failing to serve people of color. And it's been involved, all those people who have been involved is like the Chamber of Commerce, Austin Real Estate Council, Austin Board of Realtors, Home Builders Association of Greater Austin, while leaving Austin's neighborhoods of color pretty neglected with polluting facilities, flooding, unsafe streets, inadequate access to health care and healthy foods, inadequate funded schools, and substandard housing, and ultimately now, gentrification.
So it's a lot. And I hear from that, it's zoning at one point dictated where communities of color could live and intertwines with all of these other public and private forces that have caused that impact on the margin. Nefertiti, I know that you have in your time at NHCD been involved in the evolving state of these different programs and resources that do exist. Some have existed for a long time, some less time, some brand new efforts, and then the pandemic hit. So we saw rent assistance and different kinds of things. So speaking not just about the programs, but what you see in community, who are the human beings, the people who are in need of those kinds of assistance or who aren't getting what they need? What are the barriers that Black and Brown communities are facing today?
They are definitely numerous. One of the greatest challenges is the affordability of the homes in Austin. It based upon the past inequities that our communities have faced, where we have not had the economic opportunities, it prohibits us, it has prohibited Black and Brown communities from being able to maintain their homes where they have historically lived. Many have been priced out, many have been forced out. And I think one of the greatest tragedies that impacted our communities was the lack of equitable investment throughout many years. So this isn't something that is new, it isn't anything that's recent, but this ongoing disinvestment in the resources, and particularly resources that cities should have been responsible for providing all residents, no matter where they lived, especially as it relates to the infrastructure, streets, roads, schools, libraries, parks. there's just been a unequal investment. And so as a result, people sought other opportunities, right? And their homes, which is one of the first wealth pieces or opportunities that many people have to create generational wealth. Those opportunities did not exist for Black and Brown communities. And as a result, people often talk about land loss, and they often talk about it in terms of farmland and farm community. And I have started rephrasing that. There's no such thing as land loss. There's been land theft, and it has not been only to rural properties, but Black people, because of the Black and Brown people communities, have faced land theft right in urban centers as a result of the disinvestment by city governments.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just one, and I want to leave space for others, but yes, that's one thing that I can think of.
We could take a whole day long conference on that topic alone, but I think, when you talk about land theft, those who know East Austin's land history know that during urban renewal, what a lot of communities of color refer to as urban removal, there was the use of eminent domain on that East 11th, East 12th corridor, right? Some of us know Darwin Williams, whose family fought, and was one of the few families that was able to actually challenge that in the legal system.
Right.
And we also saw, eminent domain used to build the baseball fields for UT and the entire sports complex center. And that we're talking about the 80s. We're not talking about the 50s or pre-civil rights. We're talking about, the early mid 80s that was happening.
And don't forget, when you're saying eminent domain, I always use the reference to the property that was where Rosewood Courts were built. They use eminent domain to take apart park space that Black people have pooled their money together to buy to celebrate Juneteenth, right? So here it is again. There's a history of using policies, eminent domain, right? So these are state-sanctioned policies to take away spaces for particularly the African-American community, but Black and Brown communities in Austin and throughout our country, to be fair.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because today we often hear a trade-off around housing versus green space. And a lot of Austin's communities of color say we shouldn't have to choose between those two things, right? Those are basic elements of quality of life that we all should be able to enjoy. Siobhan, I want to ask you, because you're in design, what opportunities do you see to create spaces of importance that celebrate and recognize our past, while also embracing the future?
I think, as I started this field, which I myself grapple with not having more cultural representation in these sort of decision-making design process spaces, if we included more voices of people who are from diverse backgrounds, Black and Brown communities, then we would start to see that representation in those decision-making processes and in the design process. So that would provide more opportunities to celebrate identity and ideas and culture in the spaces that people create for themselves in their own communities. And we are kind of exploring this new concept called design justice, which seeks to break down that traditional concept of design where the designer is the quote unquote expert, and center more on community voices and elevate the expertise of lived experiences in that process, so that it can bring that into the design and into the physical space, and learn more from what communities want to see instead of that top-down traditional process. It's really creating a new framework for what is deemed as legitimate knowledge for, placing this power in the institution versus placing the trust and the power in the people, and working as equal partners on equal footing throughout that process.
Yeah, I mean, that is that's a important footnote there, that historically we haven't had those spaces, and that one actually has to create space, because when we talk about power dynamics and land and capital, we're not on even playing fields, but how can you create a space where people's lived experience and expertise can be recognized? Certainly we've come a long way, we have a long way to go. I want to flip the question I asked to Nefertiti and come back to Susanna. And actually, I would love all of you to weigh in on this one, but I'll start with Susanna, because we start talking about racial equity and we start learning from history. We hear a lot of the deficit-based stuff. We hear about what's been taken, we hear about what's been lost. Even today, when we talk about racial equity, we're talking about outcomes in this pandemic, what our communities of color are going through. It's people of color who are dying disproportionately. We talk about the loss, we need to bring the loss to attention, but what often gets covered up is the incredible, I don't even want to say resilience, because we're tired of being resilient, but the resourcefulness, the care, the communities of care that have allowed Black and Brown communities to survive and thrive, despite having not the same institutional privileges. So when Nefertiti mentioned, I learned about Rosewood Courts, and we're actually the first city in the country to have the public housing under FDR's, New Deal, and the Rosewood Courts and the Chalmers Courts and the Santa Rita Courts, which were both public housing and segregating. But we don't often hear that history of the park that was in the place before Rosewood Courts. And we don't often hear the stories of how Black communities actually pooled their resources and created complete communities. That when we as a city had a segregated district, that actually created these complete communities in which Black families had a local economy. And that too was taken in many ways. And that's true in the Mexican American Chicano community. So Susanna, I would love to hear in what ways, like what allows Black and Brown people to thrive and to live that quality of life despite the injustices.
Right, and I think that as people of color, we always embrace, it's a family-based culture. And I think that that's what makes a real big difference. I had a student ask me, well, what do you really like about your community? And what do you find unique? And what I really like is that it is a family-based culture. I like to see the children laughing. Here in Metropolis, the kids still play in the street. A lot of places that doesn't happen anymore. When I grew up, we played in the street. There's basketball and you shoot, but you're shooting from the street, but it's partly in the Eastman Park. And so looking at the family-based culture and looking at the elders, and then looking at, the parents and the children, you also always see like 3 generational groups of families. And I think that that's what makes Austin real unique. I think the common thread between the African American and the Latinx community is that we were living under the same forces of oppression. We were segregated. But what made it so beautiful is that because we felt a lot of indignities. If we went downtown, we crossed the highway. So we created our own businesses. We created, whether it was cleaners, it was beauty shops, it was stores, you name it. You were seeing at that time that we had the greatest assets because we were developing our own businesses. We even had credit. So there were stores where you could get credit, you could buy, and they knew that you were working class and you would pay at the end of the week. I mean, all of this bartering that went on was something that was very beautiful in the community, and the exchange of music. I think the exchange of music within the Latino and the folk music, all the different music and the African American music was very connected and intertwined and accepted. And so to me, that was a beauty. Even though we didn't have paved streets, the lights weren't there at night and all the other bad things, I never knew I was living in poverty because everybody, all the kids that I knew, we were happy. We were very happy playing and growing up. And because we were a family-based culture, it would just take two families and you would think that there was a tournament happening. But it was just because everybody had 9, 14, or 15 kids. So there were big families. And so when I look at that, that was the strength of the African American and Latinx, was the ability to create, their own businesses, everything that was needed. And I think the one advancement that the African American community had over the Latinx community was because of segregation in their schools. Their teachers were all Black. And so you had a very educated class of people living in the community, or a kind of in the periphery of the community. Whereas in the Latino community, you didn't have that. All our teachers were basically white. And you could see that, even the history, there are very few Latinx teachers that existed at our schools, even though we were like 98% Latinx in our schools. And so I think that that was the one big difference, because through that, you still get to celebrate your culture and your activities, right? And I think that that was another thing that we had in common, is that we had our celebrations. We had our very special days, and all of those things, our art and our music, was something that we very much had in common. And it made it very beautiful, even though we were pretty much segregated and living pretty much in oppressed society, is that we were able to still enjoy life. We weren't jumping off buildings because we didn't have a lot of money or stuff. We weren't committing suicides. We were living within our means also, and being like I said, in that family-based culture, is embracing life itself. And I think that that's a real uniqueness. And I just want to say real quickly, when I look at the barriers of Black and Brown people, it's institutional racism. That was the biggest barrier to all of our people, was that now is the displacement and gentrification. What Afrosia said about the loss of our land, the death of our land, the closing of our educational institutions right now that's going on. That's a very big crisis for us as people. The loss of 100% public housing. We now know, now Chalmers is market rate and public, even though they say, well, it's the same amount. It's not going to be eventually in what's happening to Rosewood and all the other public housing that's hitting us. The regionalization of our healthcare system, whereas used to have local clinics in all the neighborhoods. We're seeing the disappearing, maybe some of that coming back because of COVID, but the whole thing. And I think the other barriers now, that creating these subdivisions within people of color, subdivision housing with home ownership associations with their uncultured rules, in our community, and how detrimental that is to us. And the gated individual homes, when we were an open neighborhoods, not gated, not fenced. And all of those changes are all barriers into us really, forming the connection between ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really hit on the life itself and all of those things that make us human and give us culture and family and tradition outside of just the buildings we live in, or the zoning that we're in. Nefertiti or Siobhan, do you want to chime in just about what is it that gives us strength or allows Black and Brown communities to overcome barriers or thrive in spite of them?
I think I agree with everything that Susanna said. I mean, when you think about how and I know we sometimes we get, we're tired of being resilient, but we are. But the resiliency was based upon our connections with family, on the fact that we were connected to family, even sometimes that was not family, beyond blood, right? Whether it was church communities or other people who cared for us, neighbors. I think we always talk about looking at history to learn how to move forward. When I look at the dynamic history of the Black and Brown communities in Austin, it upsets me that we can't at least work today the way our ancestors did, right? I think about Wesley, which is right on San Bernard Street. That church was, again, it was built by formerly enslaved people who were descendants of formerly enslaved persons. They pulled their money together. It was $50,000. And that structure still exists today. When I'm in that building, I'm in awe. And I get chills to know that people could work together and build something that still stands today. And all of the efforts and work that members of Wesley and other church groups have done together, the various churches that served as benevolent societies, right? When we didn't have the social support systems. What I will say is that we have to be careful of what is happening today, and it does have to do with planning. So today, what we're seeing, especially in East Austin and in Austin's urban centers, there's this push for density. And I get it, I understand it, but what it is doing, I am concerned that the creation of 600 square foot homes, right? 900 square foot homes are not designed for families. Those are designed for individuals. And if we know anything, looking back at the history of how our families survived, how we were resilient because we were in connection and in community with one another. That is a model, that model of one, those are not our models. Those are not our models. We're people of, I think of Ubuntu. I am because we are, right? That's where our strength is. And so those designers to this group who has put this on, just maybe push for something different. I think we need to push back because they're trying to push another model that is not healthy for our communities to embrace. And I have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing that to the surface, Nefertiti, because I think, a lot of our institutions are geared toward, a dominant cultural model focused on the individual.
Right.
And
right.
Communities of color don't operate on an individual level. They are part of the village, really.
Right.
And
right.
It's exactly what y'all were talking about. What actually allows people as individuals to thrive is
right.
community.
Absolutely.
How can design actually foster that?
Right.
Siobhan, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, there was several really good points that Nefertiti brought up. And I think in terms of just getting over some of these barriers, it's really, as we're all saying, coming together as a community and celebrating identity and culture. It's amazing what can happen when we break bread together and come in these spaces and have our music and not losing sight of that. And on the other end of it, the institution, the city, the planners, investing in communities and trusting that they know their own solutions in their own neighborhoods and can make their own decisions. And, it's part of in creating that new framework. It's even for me, having gone to planning school, it is an institutionalized practice that I'm in my process of decolonizing that planner mind and trying to get back to this. I come from an earth-based culture, and that is not seen in the way that design is done right now. One of my favorite places is Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and that the design of that community where these tribes and communities came for celebrating their ceremony in this beautiful space. That design was with lunar and solar alignment and ancient rainwater capturing systems. We have that in our indigenous ancestral design, and how can that be put back into what design is and really support and celebrate the cultures that we come from, and that can in tandem reduce some of the barriers that this decision-making process almost by design has thwarted people from being thrive in their own in their own space, in their own culture, in their own city. And I think some of this design is starting to cater to that demographic trend that we're seeing with these. Because of the tech industry, there's a change in more single or couple and we're losing the population of families in the urban core. So we see design being catered to that, like Nefertiti's mentioning. So that's why it's important to have these conversations, especially with planners and designers, so that we can start to change what that process looks like. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Absolutely. So on that note, what roles can designers play in designing a more just and equitable Austin? And we'll keep in mind, I've had this conversation with architects who are interested in these issues, even passionate about learning and doing something differently. And architects have clients. Architects answer to the people who are ultimately going to own the projects and who get the final word. So what is the role of a designer in these conversations, in designing a more just and equitable Austin, or creating the space for the things that you all are talking about? And yeah, I mean, I'll kick it back to you, Siobhan. We can go in the other order, Siobhan, Nefertiti, and then Susanna.
I see the role of the planner as more as a facilitator to try to create more spaces and processes for relationship and trust building, and try to close the gap on some of these institutional top-down processes and bottom-up grassroots community power places. And the example that I think of is in our organization at Community Powered Workshop, we are working in a floodplain in Central Williamson Creek, and we, in an effort to put the community and city on equal footing, we have a community working group and a city working group. And the community working group is composed of residents from these neighborhoods that are leading because of the relationships that we had with them for years of engagement in this community, they came to us to try to drive forward some of these ideas and visions that they have for this greenway. And so they are leading the engagement and the design process, and we are taking more of that facilitator role in bringing in the city working group as the property managers from watershed and parks and rec departments to see how that collective community vision plan fits into the way that they manage these properties. So I think it's, again, centering on community voices, elevating those, the expertise of lived experience, and uplifting the traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge of those neighborhoods to have that, in turn, more so than the outcome, it's the process of relationship and trust building and capacity building, even, that we can start to have more just and equitable places. Oh, mute.
Oh my God, otra vez. Fabulous work in Central Williamson Creek. I'm very familiar with that project. My organization, GAVA, has been working with some of those folks early on in the neighborhood partnering programs. It's incredible how far y'all have come. And down the stream, actually, in East Williamson Creek, we're working with Professor Bjorn Sletto to also source that local knowledge and create some space making for the community, but also address some of the things like erosion control from the perspective of the people who have lived there. That's awesome. Nefertiti, what roles do you think designers can play in creating a more just and equitable Austin?
I think it does go back to some things Siobhan mentioned. I think it is, I'll say this, number one, I don't have a simple answer, but I think what designers have, especially those who want to be culturally sensitive, the challenge is, it depends on who is your client, right? That is a challenge, but how do we begin to elevate our voices and find a way to challenge traditional thinking. It's hard, and sometimes I'll hear people say things like, "Oh, you have such a brave voice," and I don't like hearing that. It gets really old because I don't think it's a compliment when I hear it. But it depends on who it's coming from and how it's presented. But I think we have to use our brave voices to challenge institutional thinking. Sometimes people, they do what they know how to do, right? So they're not going to do anything different. So I think just sometimes by our presence, it allows, if we're bold enough to share our thoughts and our ideas, if we're bold enough to do that, I think the confidence will come um, to try something different, but then also centering design around people who are impacted, right? I think that's what's important. How do people, even, I'll give you an example with the 600 square feet apartments. I'm trying to figure out if we're seeking to design spaces in these urban centers and we want people to walk and bike. When you go in these spaces, I'm trying to figure out if I had a bike, where am I going to put a bike? Right? So how do you where was the designer and why wasn't there a conversation with those people who would live there, right? Where do I put this, a simple thing as a bike, right? So I think and I think that should be the case with whether we're doing contracting, whether we're doing designs as an architect or planners, like human-centered design should include engaging those who are most impacted by whatever we're seeking to solve for. And I think that's something that's across the board. So it's not specific to design or architecture, but everything and how we live. It should be centered around the people who we are solving for and their needs.
Thank you for that. Susanna, take us home on this question. What is the role of designers in creating more just and equitable Austin?
Well, I have to say I agree with Sharon and Nefertiti that it is about the engagement part, about the community. And it's a lot easier when you're looking at design when it's a public building and you're the client, the public is the building. And I want to give you an example. And then if you get a chance, go to the Parks and Recreation and look at the Montopolis Recreation Center and Community Center, because we fought in 2012, we had to go to get it on the bond to get a new recreation center. And then the health department also jumped on that. So we fought for about, the reason the Montopolis Recreation Center is just now complete is because we had to fight tooth and nail about the design and the ownership of the building, because at one time, the health department was taking over the majority part of our recreation center, even though they received 3 million of bond money and we received over 11 million of the bond money. So as a community, we had to really fight as a Montopolis Neighborhood Association to get the square footage. And once we were able to get the square footage, then we talked about the design that we wanted to make sure that there was a track on the top on the second floor so our elders could walk inside the recreation center, or even mothers with toddlers. We wanted to make sure there was a senior activity room because that was what was lacking in Montopolis. And our seniors refused to get on the bus to go to Conley or to Meds, but they will go when it's right in their community. We also looked at the design because we knew that KIPP and East Austin College Prep picked up their kids at the rec center. So we say, wait a minute, you need to design the parking space in the back so the buses could come through and pick up the kids and leave and then drop them off. So we had to look at the design of how that was going to be, the design inward also. And then here comes the other one. Then we had to challenge Austin arts in public places, because what had happened is at the Montopolis Neighborhood Center, they picked an artist and he drew these dragon eggs, but nobody knew what they were. They weren't culturally sensitive. They didn't relate to us and people hated it, right? And so we go like, no, that's not going to happen here, you know? And so Luckily, we got some good people that taken the class on undoing racism, so they had become more consciously aware about the racism and the history. And then we had to fight to be on the panel to select the artists. I mean, these are all the steps that it took the community. But I asked everybody to go because on the outside, there's an indigenous screen for the windows display, and it's sports from an indigenous perspective, and they're animals from indigenous perspective. So also that the kids could enjoy. And down there's a mural that's huge, and it is a mural of people and not of color. They're different colors, purple, yellow, whatever. But it's the history of Montopolis. It's the elders standing out there, and it's the children, it's the cornfield, it's the tree, it's the road, it's the original wooden Montopolis bridge. All of that is in that mural. You go inside, and there's a huge display of the history of Montopolis in sort of mosaic type with ancient pictures, communities. I mean, everything is it's all so beautiful. That was a complete community controlled from the design to the cultural art that would be there. And it's one of the most beautiful centers now that we have, in all of Montopolis. And hopefully, now that it's so beautiful and put together, we don't get completely displaced and we don't get to benefit from all the work that it took us from 2012 to 2020 to get that community center. But it all is in listening to the people who have been there for generations, because they know better. They wouldn't have known that the bus picks up the kids there and that we needed to have, the driveway made so that the buses could continue to pick up the kids who are in other school districts. They wouldn't have known from all of that. They wouldn't have known that, hey, we have a lot of seniors and we need an indoor track. Could it be above the gym? Could you do this? Could you do that? And so to us, that's an example of the designers, the planners, all the way to the arts people, everything really listening to the people, but more important is the people demanding it, the people holding their ground. I mean, we had to hold our ground, and it wasn't easy, but we held our ground. And what happened is the most beautiful, beautiful center that embraces our history, our culture, our art, and it's useful for all the community.
Amazing. So please, if you're in Austin, do check out the Montopolis Recreation Center. Over a decade, and I know it was a long fight just to get the original recreation center. Yeah. So I know this goes back generations. Thank you all for your perspective on those questions. I'm going to open it up to some questions we've gotten in the chat and also in the Q&A box. So we're gonna take these on now. Susana, you mentioned displacement here, but anybody can feel free to jump in on this one. So one attendee said, many private companies and interests are establishing major presences in Austin, which of course can exacerbate problems with equality and affordability. What role can or should they be playing in helping the city rectify these issues?
Are you talking about the private corporations that are coming in, the business?
Yeah, so private companies and interests, and we see the big tech companies, making homes here, Google and Facebook and Apple and everybody, right? But other interests coming to Austin in general, what role can or should they be playing?
Well, they should be playing a major role because they're adding fuel to the fire, to the displacement. And I'll give you Montopolis as one of the, the Uprooted report said if there was one community you could still salvage and save, it would be Montopolis, because Cesar Chavez was gone, Holly was gone, Go Valley Johnson was on the way, but Montopolis. And now that we have Tesla coming in, which is a major, major development with thousands of people that are going to be coming in, we're already feeling the speculations. We have 4 zoning cases where they all want to destroy single family zoning and upzone to condos and townhomes. And already in some of the most poverty streets in Montopolis, we now have $400,000 homes being built in Montopolis. And so One is that the corporations need to be given funding to, we have the Metropolis Community Development Corporation that we've now established, but we need the funding so that we can be buying up these properties, and not to build affordable housing, but to build low income housing, people at 30, 40, and 50. That is our target for building that. We also think that, the other part is we started the East Austin Conservancy because we are asking the corporations to give funding to pay people's property taxes, help them with their property taxes so we could sustain them in place, because we couldn't use government money for that. And so those are, I think, two ways that they can help, is getting funds. And there's a Rosewood Community Development Corporation, but I'll say that these corporations are the only ones run by people of color who actually live in the neighborhood. All these other nonprofit housing people are run by white people. And so where is it, the support and the equity in giving funding to people who live in the communities, who work with the communities, and who know what the issues and concerns are in the community? And I think that the corporations haven't really been paying their fair share of the funds, and that the city has been notorious in siphoning off that money by saying, you need to build a green space in a park, and you have to give money to that, when they know the real crucial issue is housing. That's a very big crucial. What is the priority? Housing is a really big issue. Look at all the homelessness and the people who are three generationals having to live together because they can't afford the housing. So I think they have a big role. Not only do they have a big role, but the city has a big role to play. And they haven't been doing it because they own over 1,000 properties, where what makes building affordable housing costly is the land. But if you own the land, you can do it. And so the city is not doing its share of the public land that's owned by we the people. And so those are some of the things that I think that we need to be looking at. They need to be looking at, when we look at what they can be looking at, is the people's plan, the institutional racism systemic report, the housing blueprint report, the displacement and gentrification report. There's all recommendations there that can be done. And I think there's a big role for private corporations and the city of Austin, and also the county.
Yeah, these are really great opportunities that do exist. And I saw Ms. Patricia Calhoun in an earlier comment had mentioned the pressure on especially elders in the community who are facing that tax burden, when home ownership has often been the only asset acquisition that communities of color have been able to engage in, and are now at risk of losing their home, their only asset. I know the East Austin Conservancy has supported a lot of elders in keeping their home. And so as designers may not be able to make the final call, but as a designer, if you're aware of these things, aware of this history, aware of these resources, if you're talking to the people with the big pocket, the deep pockets, it's worth making them aware that there are opportunities to actually offset some of the damages. We have another question here, and unless Nefertiti or Siobhan, you want to take a stab at the role that some of those companies play. But we got another one here that might be interesting. So Jen B says, have you had success or particular challenges to get community members to meet with you and be met by planners in the city, et cetera? One of the things I've noticed in Austin, specifically with Capital Metro, is there has been community engagement, in quotes, but done in a way that doesn't really make it easy for locals in neighborhoods to attend. For example, meetings at 6 p.m. when one doesn't get off until 7, or isn't working in their neighborhood and has to commute, or has to get dinner on the table, whatever it is, right? So have you seen successful or challenging situations in getting community and planners in the city to meet? Siobhan, you were giving some examples of success, but Nefertiti looked like you wanted to jump in. Sorry, this is my first Zoom moderator.
Siobhan. Yeah,
okay, Siobhan, go ahead, Siobhan and Nefertiti.
Yeah, I think a part of it goes to what I was saying earlier with creating new frameworks and seeing other methods of this as quote unquote legitimate, and not these traditional ways that seem to have barriers to access and make decisions. So I'm a huge proponent of storytelling as a way to not just engage with communities, but collaborate with communities in a way that there's more access to, self-determination, and collaborating with artists can be a really creative, transformative process where the culture comes into play more so, and it's working in a different way that is more approachable and kind of facilitates those spaces and connections and meeting people where they're at with the people that are already part of that community. So, and there's multiple ways. Storytelling goes from anywhere from just using your voice and sharing that as an audio recording to having a community-based mural in celebrating spaces in communities. So that's been a way that we, especially now as we're trying to figure this out in the pandemic, it's exploring creative ways to try to have that community collaboration.
Yeah, Nefertiti.
I would just like to add, I'm going to give two sides to this. Number one, I applaud the community, and we do have to stay engaged. Susanna was saying that the community, they got what they wanted, but they had to demand it in terms of what was eventually materialized at Montopolis. Number one, community has to know what they want, right? So we have to know what we want and demand and be consistent in that. On the other hand, I think there needs to be a push and a level of accountability on the side of city staffers. We have to understand, I guess I've also worked in ministry many years ago. And so I always, no matter what area of work I'm in, I see myself as a servant of the people. And so as city staffers, to me, I go back to the role that I think that we should play, and that's to serve the people. Like who are we? And if we see that we serve the people, then our intentions should be geared towards helping and providing and designing systems and policies and programs and directing resources to those who are the most vulnerable. And that's what we do not do. We often pander to people with the loudest voices, with the most money, with the most resources, and that's problematic. And so there does need to be some work on behalf of city employees to, again, but this goes back to that, the institutionalized racism. It is so deep, right? Because I think we're putting too much of a burden on community in terms of, well, if you don't show up, and well, we didn't hear from community and we tried. And Austin, I'm new to Austin. I've only been here since 2017. It is, I like the engagement, but to ask people who are working, who are single mothers, who to always give to me, it's exhausting. And I think we have to, and it doesn't mean that we don't exclude community voices. That's not what I'm saying. And I think we have to include them. But I just think the city needs to look at themselves and see, who are we going to be accountable to? And I just want us to take a greater responsibility in doing what's right for those who don't have a voice.
And I just want to follow up on that, Carmen, as I can, because I think that one of the things that the city, as Nefertiti was saying, that really falls back on the people to supposedly have to know all of these things, is that there has to be a lot of education. When Poder started, we had to teach people about zoning. We had to break down all the zoning case and what they represented. We had to translate all of this stuff. So the city wasn't doing any of that. And back then, the notices were even worse. There was so much text in there, you didn't even know what the hell was going on. And most of the people just threw it in the trash because they couldn't comprehend it. The notices have gotten a little bit better, but they're still not that great. But at least they're out there, right? but it's like, how do you educate and how do you inform the residents what all this mean? What does small lot cottages mean? What does setbacks mean? You know, what is townhouses? What is FF3, SF6? What do these all mean to people? And I think that the city is failing in, like they say, if you really want the community to be involved, you know, you need to also give them all this information and have all these training and skills so they can. And I think the other big culprit, and I think Sharon touched on this, was the universities. I saw in the University of Texas, and I've gone to do presentation at the School of Architects and stuff, and I even had the professor say, wow, we didn't even think about all of this. Well, they should be thinking about a lot of things about communities and communities of color and historic racism, and that needs to be part of the whole architectural classes. You know, there's a lot that needs to be told, and asking the questions. I remember when we did the Go Valley Johnson plan, we had two young planners that came out of the university, and they were the planners for the Go Valley Johnson, and they did it the right way. We told them, don't start from the beginning, start what's there, and then what we need to clean up in our communities. We rezoned over 600 properties, but I tell you, when those two planners went to present before the Planning Commission and the City Council, they were chastised. They were raked over the coals, but they stayed firm with the community. But after that, one of the planners says, I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving because I can't take the way the city does it and how it treats, you know, low-income and communities of color. So, but a lot of this is, like you say, how do you undo all the things that they teach you in the university and not necessarily looking at what that impact. You know, I always see that everything in forms of numbers and stuff, but not in the form of people. Everything is about height and regulations and stuff, but it's not talking about people. And I think that that's what's really missing.
I think it's a powerful reminder that designers can play a role, they can push back, and that there are consequences, there's blowback, but this is a community of designers. I mean, this is a community, an opportunity to network and not be a lone gunner pushing against the system, but actually be part of a movement to change things. We had a question on a policy level, what should anti-racist designers support to halt displacement in Austin? And so I just wanted to reiterate that Susana mentioned the People's Plan for Anti-Displacement, which was 6 resolutions that grassroots communities developed with an immense amount of housing knowledge, working with friendly lawyers and developers, and most importantly, from the community's perspective, creating these 6 resolutions, one of which has been partially adopted, the right to return policy, which has become adopted into a preferential policy for the Austin Housing Finance Corporation to give preference to people with historic ties to Austin, not East Austin, but Austin citywide. So that's one, but as Susana mentioned, the mayor's task force for institutional racism and systemic inequities has a report with a huge amount of housing stuff. Nefertiti actually chaired the anti-displacement task force that also put together a report which includes elements of the People's Plan and many other recommendations. So those are resources to inform yourself about and to share with your community. And we had a question, we only have 2 minutes left, so I think we're going to be wrapping this up, but in a few words, somebody did ask, and I'm going to rephrase this a little, how can we, the melanated designers or the designers of color, be more involved and raise more awareness for Black and Brown communities in Austin? I think we spoke a little bit to it, but any last inspirational words y'all want to give before we close out?
Yeah, I would say for them to attend, you know, especially the neighborhood plan contact teams. That's where you really get to talk about, you know, zoning and design and all of these different things, right? And I think even to be able to sit in with, you know, predominantly people of color contact teams, I think is the most important one. And so establishing those connections and then learning about what's really happening in the community.
Absolutely. I would like to add, I was in a conversation yesterday with ULI. They did a 21-day equitable challenge and really trying to, and yesterday's conversation was about how can we take what we've learned and put this into action. And so I will say for anyone interested in learning more, ULI Austin, they do have a website. They have great resources, many of the resources that Carmen has mentioned, to get a lot of background information. But going to places and networking, even when it's uncomfortable, I attend some of the breakfasts and stuff, and it's hard seeing that there are so few people in the design field, in real estate, who from the Black and Brown community. So putting yourself out there, getting connected, and sometimes you might be the only one, but you begin to open up the space for other people to follow up, to allow your voices to be heard.
And agree, and I'll just add that, let's keep the conversations going, even if they're difficult, and move some of those pieces into action. And I'm personally, seeking those other melanated designers to try to have these new ways of engaging in design processes with communities and celebrating our culture and identity, being proud of it in our field that is challenging to be, trying to bring in those other perspectives in an institution that hasn't always engaged in that. So I'm excited that this networking opportunity happen, and see what we can do about it on the ground.
Thank you all so much, Siobhan Otero, Nefertiti Jackman, and Susana Almanza, who's taking a picture of us right now. We appreciate your voices, your wisdom. Thank you all to the participants and the questions. And Nefertiti also mentioned, study the history of other designers and architects who have done the great work in the past. So we hope you all enjoyed the panel. Take this inspiration with you. There are more resources to check out. And someone asked for volunteer opportunities, so we will certainly pass that question along to Latinos in architecture and our panelists to get in touch. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.